The year was 1862, and the atmosphere along the Kentucky-Tennessee border was heavy enough to crush the spirit. It was a landscape of extremes, where the damp mountain air off the Cumberland plateau tangled with the stagnant rot of the river bottoms, creating a suffocating veil over the earth. Here the boundary between the hills and the hollers was porous, shifting with the rains, much like the precarious balance of power that held the region together. On the desolate stretch of land, known as the Holloway Plantation, the silence of the night was usually absolute, save for the rhythmic rasp of cicadas or the distant mournful cry of a whippoorwill. But on this specific night, the silence in the slave quarters was charged with a kinetic energy, a static electricity that made the hair on one's arm stand up. In a cabin that leaned precariously against the wind, a child was being born who would dismantle the logic of her world. If you are drawn to the hidden histories of resistance and the legends that rose from the soil of American sorrow, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. These stories are a shared inheritance, and we're glad you're here to witness this one. The midwife presiding over the birth was a woman named Ruth, an elder whose gnarled hands held the medical and spiritual knowledge of 3 generations. She knew immediately that this was no ordinary arrival. The moon was entirely absent from the sky, a true and heavy darkness. Yet the single tallow candle Ruth had brought refused to hold a flame. 3 times she struck flint to steel, and 3 times a draft that came from nowhere, a breath of cold air in the sweltering cabin, snuffed it out. Resigned to the shadows, Ruth worked by touch and instinct, her fingers reading the mother's contractions like Braille. When the infant finally slipped into the world, there was no cry, no gasping protest against the cold air. The child simply opened her eyes. Even in the gloom, Ruth could see them. They were unsettlingly bright, possessing irises scattered with flecks of gold that seemed to catch a light that didn't exist in the room. The baby stared at the midwife with a calm, terrifying intensity, an ancient awareness that stopped Ruth's breath in her throat. This was not a blank slate. This was a soul that had arrived with its luggage already packed. Sarah, the mother, was only 22. Yet her body was a testament to the brutal mathematics of the plantation system. She had been laboring in the Holloway tobacco fields since she was 6. Her skin weathered by the relentless sun, and her back mapped with the raised keloids of the overseer's lash. She had been treated not as a human being, but as a biological asset, her existence recorded in ledgers alongside livestock and crop yields. This child was the result of a forced union, a cold calculation by the Holloway family to increase their stock by breeding Sarah with a man from a neighboring property, a man she barely knew and never saw again. But as Sarah took the silent infant into her arms, the crushing weight of her reality fractured. Looking down at the girl, whose skin was a deep, radiant obsidian that seemed to absorb the shadows, Sarah felt the sudden, violent intrusion of hope. It was a dangerous emotion, perhaps the most dangerous thing a person could possess in a place designed to extinguish it. She named the girl Zora, after a grandmother who had been stolen from the Gold Coast and who had died whispering of a place where her people commanded the iron and the earth, answering to no master but the sky. That grandmother had been a practitioner of what the masters fearfully called witchcraft, and what the community knew as rootwork or hoodoo, a complex spiritual technology of survival, healing, and defense transported across the Middle Passage in the minds of the captive. Ruth remembered Sarah's grandmother well. She had been a woman who could turn the wind with a whisper and cure fevers with weeds that grew by the roadside. Ruth saw that same dormant voltage in the newborn Zora, It was an inheritance of power that had skipped a generation, lying dormant in Sarah, only to erupt in her daughter. As Zora grew, this difference became impossible to ignore. She did not learn the lessons of submission that were beaten into the other children. She did not lower her gaze when white people passed. She did not shrink to make herself invisible. Instead, she walked with her chin lifted, moving through the quarters with the regal bearing of a displaced queen. By the time she was a toddler, the enslaved community watched her with a mixture of protective love and deep anxiety, knowing that such a spirit was usually broken quickly and violently by the machinery of the plantation. The first true manifestation of her nature occurred when Zora was just 2 years old. She had wandered away from the supervision of the older children and found her way into the main plantation house, a forbidden zone where the penalty for trespassing was severe. She was found in the parlor, sitting on the bench of the grand piano. But she wasn't banging on the keys like a toddler. She was pressing them with deliberate, eerie precision, producing a haunting, dissonant melody that sounded like weeping. The overseer, a sadist named Garrett, who prided himself on his ability to break the spirit of the enslaved, found her there. Garrett was a man of leather and grit, his humanity long ago eroded by the brutality of his trade. He reached for the heavy coiled whip at his belt, intending to teach the child a permanent lesson about boundaries. God cut the rod out early. He had sneered, raising his arm to strike. But the blow never landed. Witnesses, house slaves peering from the hallway, later whispered that as Garrett raised his arm, Zora stopped playing and simply turned to look at him with those amber, flecked eyes. In that instant, the overseer gasped, clutching his chest as if he had been struck by a sledgehammer. His face drained of color, turning a sickly ash gray. He staggered back, dropping the whip, his eyes bulging as he fought for air against an invisible constriction, as though iron bands were being tightened around his ribs by a ghostly hand. He collapsed to one knee, wheezing, overwhelmed by a sensation of pure primal dread that had no physical source. The moment he crawled backward, breaking eye contact with the toddler, the pain vanished, leaving him trembling and soaked in a cold sweat. Garrett never spoke of what he saw in the child's eyes, but he never raised a hand against Zora again. He avoided her with a superstitious terror, crossing the road if he saw her approaching, a reaction that did not go unnoticed by the rest of the plantation. Years passed, and the legend of the girl grew in the quiet whispers of the quarters. Zora was 5 when Sarah began to secretly plot their escape, driven by the realization that her daughter's supernatural tether would eventually be seen not as a curiosity, but as a threat that had to be eliminated. The plantation was a place of stagnant misery, but around Zora, the laws of nature seemed pliable. Vicious tracking dogs, trained to tear human flesh, would whimper and roll over on their bellies when she passed. Padlocks on the food stores would click open when she lingered near them, allowing the starving field hands to steal scraps of pork during the lean winter months. Ruth, recognizing that the girl needed guidance to control this volatile gift, began to train her in the old ways. Under the cover of the pre-dawn mist deep in the woods, Ruth taught Zora the language of the earth, which roots could stop a heart, and which could mend it, how to read the warnings written in the flight of crows, and how to craft mojo bags for protection. But the most important lesson Ruth taught her was psychological, that the chains were forged of iron, but the power of the master was a construct, an illusion that could be dismantled by a stronger will. By the autumn of 1862, the world outside the plantation was burning. The Civil War had erupted, tearing the nation apart, and the structure of the plantation began to fray. The master's sons rode off in gray uniforms to fight for the Confederacy, leaving the estate guarded and chaotic. However, the fear of insurrection led to tighter patrols and swifter executions for runaways. The tension was palpable. The air smelled of impending violence. Zora, now 10 years old, was hovering on the precipice of womanhood, a dangerous time for any enslaved girl. Garrett, the overseer, had begun watching her again, not with the old fear, but with a new predatory glint in his eyes, a calculating look that Sarah recognized with sickening clarity. She knew they were running out of time, but the final push came from Zora herself. For 3 consecutive nights, the girl woke screaming from a vision. She saw men with lanterns, the glint of shackles, and blood soaking the soil of the quarters. On the 3rd morning, she looked at her mother, her face grave and ancient. "We have to go tonight," Zora said, her voice carrying the weight of a prophecy. "If we stay, we don't wake up." Sarah trusted the girl's sight more than she trusted her own fears. That day, they prepared in silence. They possessed almost nothing, but they gathered what mattered. A small sack of cornmeal Sarah had been hoarding grain by grain, a stolen kitchen knife sharpened to a razor's edge, and a leather pouch prepared by Ruth. The old midwife pressed the bag into Zora's hands with a fierce, trembling grip. Inside were the tools of their survival: High John the Conqueror root, graveyard dirt, and a slip of paper inscribed with symbols that Ruth's own grandmother had drawn from memory of the old country. "You are not what they say you are," Ruth whispered, her eyes wet. "The world is wide and you have the power to walk through it. Don't let them catch you, child. Make them afraid." As the moon vanished behind a bank of heavy clouds, plunging the world into a protective darkness, Sarah and Zora slipped out of the cabin. They did not head north, as was the custom for runaways, but east, toward the vast, untamed expanse of the Cumberland River and the labyrinth of the unknown. They moved initially toward the Cumberland, a vast, dark artery of water that cut through the heart of the landscape. It was a counterintuitive choice. The North Star beckoned them toward the Ohio River and the distant promise of Union territory, but Zora had insisted on the water. "The river has a mouth that doesn't speak," she had whispered to her mother, her small hand gripping Sarah's calloused palm with surprising strength. They waded into the current just as the first gray dilution of night began to suggest the coming dawn. The water was cool and murky, thick with silt and the unseen movement of river creatures. To Sarah, every submerged log felt like an alligator, every splash a patrol boat. But Zora moved with her eerie calm, her head above the surface like a swimming otter, navigating the currents as if she had a map etched into her mind. They let the river carry them downstream, drifting with the flow to conserve energy, their feet only occasionally brushing the soft, sucking mud of the riverbed. If you're rooting for Zora and Sarah to make it through the impossible, hit that like button to send them some strength. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Back at the plantation, the alarm was raised with the rising sun, though it came later than it should have. Old Isaiah, the keeper of the bell that summoned the enslaved to the fields, had noticed the empty cabin and the missing women before the first light hit the cotton rows. Isaiah was nearly 70, a man whose spirit had been ground down by decades of bondage. Yet, he remembered the way Zora had once looked at him, a look that made him feel like a man rather than a mule. In a quiet act of treason that could have cost him his life, Isaiah delayed ringing the bell. He fumbled with the rope, feigned a coughing fit, and wasted a precious hour of the morning. That single hour was a gift of distance, a gap between the fugitives and the hounds that would prove crucial. By the time the overseer Garrett realized the absence, and the plantation erupted into chaos. Sarah and Zora had already vanished into the tree line, where the river fed into the coastal marshlands. The Holloways did not rely on local patrols for this. The escape of a field hand was a nuisance. The escape of the girl whom they had begun to view with a mixture of covetousness and superstitious dread was a crisis. They sent for Silus Krenshaw. Krenshaw was not a mere slave patroller. He was a specialist, a man whose name was whispered with fear across 3 states. He was a professional hunter of human beings, a mercenary who had turned the tracking of runaways into a grim science. He arrived at the plantation just before noon, riding a massive rangeling and trailing a pack of 6 Cuban bloodhounds. Beasts bred for aggression and stamina, with ears that dragged the ground and noses that could pull a scent out of a rainstorm. Krenshaw was a terrifying figure, tall, gaunt, and dressed in drab oilskin that shed water and mud. His face was like a cliffside, craggy and immovable, with pale gray eyes that possessed the dead flat effect of a shark. He carried a customized rifle, a coil of heavy rope, and a set of iron shackles that jingled softly against his saddle, a sound that was the music of nightmares for the enslaved population of the region. Krenshaw wasted no time with pleasantries. He listened to Garrett's blustering report with bored detachment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "How long?" was all he asked, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. When told it had been nearly 8 hours, he didn't blink. He had caught men with a 3-day head start. He dismounted and entered the cabin where Sarah and Zora had lived, moving with a predator's economy. He picked up a rag doll Zora had left behind, bringing it to his nose, then offered it to the lead hound, a massive brute named Titus. The dog inhaled the scent deeply, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but then did something Krenshaw had never seen. It sneezed violently and backed away, whining, rubbing its snout against the dirt floor, as if trying to scrub the smell out. Krenshaw frowned, a flicker of unease passing through him. He forced the dog back to the scent, kicking it in the ribs until it complied. "Smart runaways go to water," he muttered to Garrett. "But water only hides you for so long. Eventually, you have to come up for air, and you have to touch ground." The hunt began in earnest. The party consisted of Krenshaw, his pack of hounds, and 2 hired guns. Hard men named Boggs and Doyle, who were eager for the bounty money. They picked up the trail at the riverbank, where the footprints entered the mud. "They went in here," Krenshaw noted, pointing to the slide marks. "Woman and a child. They'll be slow. The current is pushing south. We ride the bank." He was confident, operating on years of experience and the certainty of his own superiority. But as they rode, following the river's winding course, the trail didn't behave as it should. Usually runaways would exit the water within a mile or 2, desperate to get out of the cold and the exposure. But miles passed, and there was no sign of them emerging. It was as if the river had simply swallowed them whole. It wasn't until late afternoon that the dogs finally struck a scent again miles downstream, at a place where the river dissolved into the chaotic geography of the salt marshes. Here the ground became a treacherous mix of sawgrass, black water, and hammocks of solid earth. A labyrinth designed to kill the uninitiated. As the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, the terrain turned hostile. The horses struggled in the muck, sinking to their fetlocks. Their breathing labored in the humid air. The sawgrass was tall enough to hide a man on horseback, and it sliced at their clothes and skin. This was the borderland, a place where civilization ended and the primal, ancient world began. Krenshaw felt a creeping irritation. The trail they had found was clear, footprints leading deep into the swamp, but it felt too clear, almost inviting. The dogs were agitated, their behavior erratic. They would bay excitedly at a patch of reeds, only to find nothing, or cower from a shadow that held no danger. Titus, the lead dog, kept stopping to look back at the trees they had passed, his hackles raised, growling at the empty air. "Something's wrong with these mutts," Boggs complained, swatting a mosquito the size of a coin. "Heat's getting to him." Krenshaw said nothing, but his grip on the reins tightened. It wasn't the heat. He knew dogs. He knew fear. And his dogs were terrified. Miles ahead, in the deepening gloom of the swamp, Sarah was nearing the end of her endurance. Her legs were numb from the cold water, her skirt heavy with mud, her feet cut and bleeding. But Zora pulled her onward, relentless. The girl seemed to draw energy from the swamp itself, her eyes glowing brighter as the daylight faded. They reached a small elevated island, a hammock dominated by a massive twisting live oak tree draped in Spanish moss that looked like the gray beards of wizards. "Here," Zora said, her voice small but commanding. "We rest here." Sarah collapsed onto the root structure of the tree, shivering uncontrollably. "They're coming. Baby," she wept, the terror she had suppressed all day finally breaking through. "I can hear the dogs. That man, Krenshaw, he never stops." Zora knelt beside her mother, taking the pouch Ruth had given her from her dress. She began to pull out the items, the roots, the bones, the paper with the symbols. "Hail, stop," Zora said, her tone devoid of fear, replaced by a cold, glittering purpose. "He thinks he's hunting us, Mama. But tonight the swamp is going to hunt him." As night fell, absolute and suffocating, the hunters made camp on a strip of dry land 2 miles back. They were frustrated, muddy, and on edge. The swamp was noisy with the sounds of night, the croaking of bullfrogs, the splash of gars, the screech of owls, but underneath the noise lay a heavy, watchful silence. Krenshaw sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to press against the circle of light. He was a man of logic, of bullets and blood. But the atmosphere here felt charged with something he couldn't name. Suddenly, the fire, which had been burning brightly, hissed and died, plunging them into total blackness. There was no wind, no rain. It was as if the oxygen had simply been withdrawn from the air. In the sudden dark, Doyle screamed. "Something touched me," he yelled, scrabbling for a match. When the flare of the lucifer finally illuminated the camp again, they were alone. But on the ground, in the center of their camp, lay a perfect circle of white stones that hadn't been there a moment before. And in the middle of the stones sat a small crude doll made of marsh grass, its head twisted backward, staring directly at Silus Krenshaw. The silence that followed the discovery of the grass doll was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered even the bravado of hired guns. Doyle stared at the small twisted figure sitting in the center of the white stones, his eyes wide and rimmed with the white, hot panic of a man whose worldview is collapsing. The doll wasn't just a crude effigy. It was a message bound with human hair and smelling faintly of grave dirt and ozone. Krenshaw, shaking off the momentary paralysis that had gripped the camp, kicked the doll into the darkness with a snarl of disgust. "It's a trick," he barked, his voice ragged but loud enough to shatter the quiet. "Just nigger superstition meant to scare weak-minded fools. They're watching us, trying to spook us because they know they can't outrun us." But even as he spoke, relighting the fire with a furious striking of flint, he felt the lie of his own words. The air around them had grown inexplicably cold, a wet, seeping chill that ignored their coats and settled deep in the marrow of their bones. If you're wondering just how far Zora's powers can reach, or if you believe in the old stories of rootwork protecting the vulnerable, drop a comment below. And if you're new here, Hit that subscribe button to join our community of history seekers. Sleep was a fugitive that night. The men took shifts watching the perimeter. Backs to the fire, rifles leveled at the wall of black sawgrass that surrounded them. But the darkness was not empty. Throughout the night, the sounds of the marsh shifted from the natural to the impossible. They heard the crying of a baby, distinct, heartbreaking, and human, coming from the center of a deep water channel where no child could be. Then came the sound of chains, the heavy rhythmic clanking of iron shackles dragging through mud, circling the camp, moving closer, then receding, then returning. The dogs, usually the most reliable sentinels, were useless. They huddled together in a shivering mass, whining pitifully, refusing to look out into the dark. At one point, Titus, the massive lead hound, stood up and stared at an empty patch of ground, his tail tucked, and let out a howl that sounded less like a dog and more like a man screaming in agony. It was a sound that made Boggs cross himself and mutter prayers he hadn't said since childhood. Miles away, on the hammock beneath the ancient oak, Zora was awake. She sat cross-legged on the earth, her small hands moving over a collection of objects arranged in a precise geometry. A bird's skull, a piece of pyrite, dried sage, and a lock of hair she had snagged from a bramble earlier that day. Her eyes were open but unseeing, the amber flecks swirling like nebulae. She was exhausted, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air, a trickle of blood leaking from her left nostril. Sarah watched her daughter, with a terrifying mixture of pride and helplessness. She wanted to snatch Zora up, to tell her to stop, to run, but she knew that running was no longer enough. They had to fight. "I'm in their heads, Mama," Zora whispered, her voice sounding raspy and old. "I'm showing them the things they fear most. I'm making the water look like blood. I'm making the trees look like men with no faces." As she slumped forward, the connection breaking, gasping for air, as if she'd been underwater. The big one, the leader. His mind is hard like a stone wall, but I'm finding the cracks. The sun rose on the second day, but it brought no relief. The light was pale and sickly, filtering through a heavy mist that refused to lift. The camp was in disarray. When Krenshaw went to check the horses, he found them lathered in sweat, eyes rolling as if they had been ridden hard all night despite being tethered. But the real blow came from the dogs. One of the hounds, a vicious tracker named Brutus, was gone. The rope hadn't been chewed through. The knot had been untied. It lay on the ground, the intricate loops undone with human dexterity. They were here. Doyle whispered, spinning in a circle, his rifle shaking in his hands. They walked right into the camp while we were sitting here and let the dog loose. "We're going to die out here, Krenshaw. I'm telling you, this is hate work." Krenshaw struck Doyle across the face, a sharp, violent blow that knocked the man to the mud. "Shut your mouth," Krenshaw hissed, his face inches from Doyle's. "We ride. We finish this. No one walks away from Silus Krenshaw." They pressed on, but the marsh seemed to have rearranged itself overnight. The trail, which had been clear the day before, was now a confusing tapestry of false leads. Footprints would appear clearly in the mud, leading them into a thicket of thorns, only to vanish abruptly. Marks on trees seemed to shift positions when they weren't looking. The compass needle on Crenshaw's saddle horn spun lazily, unable to find north, drawn by some magnetic anomaly that defied explanation. The heat rose, suffocating and wet, bringing with it swarms of biting flies that targeted the eyes and mouths of men and beasts alike. And then the visions began. It started with Boggs. He was riding Sweep, trailing the group, when he suddenly reined his horse in with a shout. There by the cypress, he pointed a shaking finger at a stand of trees 50 yards away. "I saw her. The girl. She was standing right there looking at me. The Krenshaw wheeled his horse around, rifle raised, but there was nothing but moss and shadow. "You're seeing things, Boggs," he snapped, though his own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Sunstroke and fear." "I saw her," Boggs insisted, his face pale and slick with sweat. "She didn't look right, boss. She was floating, and she was smiling. Not like a kid smiles, like a wolf smiles." They investigated the spot, splashing through knee, deep black water. There were no footprints, no disturbed vegetation. But carved into the trunk of the cypress tree, fresh and oozing sap, was a symbol. A circle with a cross through it, the ends of the cross hooked like barbs. It was the same symbol that had been on the paper in Zora's bag. Krenshaw stared at it, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He recognized it vaguely from stories old slaves used to tell, a mark of the crossroads, a warning that you were entering a space where the laws of the living no longer applied. As the day wore on, the psychological deterioration of the hunting party accelerated. Doyle began to weep silently as he rode, muttering about his mother and sins he had committed years ago. Boggs kept looking over his shoulder, convinced that the trees were moving closer every time he turned his back. Even Krenshaw, the Iron Man, began to feel the fraying of his reality. He saw movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that elongated and reached for him, shapes in the water that looked like drowning faces. He developed a pounding headache, a spike of agony behind his eyes that pulsed in time with the cicadas screaming. He realized with a dawning horror that they were being herded. The trail they were following, the subtle signs of broken twigs and disturbed mud, were not mistakes made by a panicked mother. They were breadcrumbs. Zora was leading them deeper into the most treacherous part of the marsh, away from solid ground, into a place where the horses would be useless and the heavy men would be slow. By late afternoon, the terrain had become a nightmare. The water was waist deep in places, black and foul-smelling. The horses were panicking, fighting the reins, terrified of the things brushing against their legs underwater. They reached a dead end, a vast expanse of open, stagnant water surrounded by a wall of impenetrable cypress knees. There was no way forward, and when they turned to go back, the path they had cut seemed to have closed up, the sawgrass knitting itself together to block their retreat. They were trapped, and then from everywhere and nowhere, a sound began. It was a low humming, a vibration that rattled their teeth. It grew louder, layering upon itself a chorus of voices humming an old, sorrowful spiritual. "Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children." The sound didn't come from human throats. It came from the wind, the water, the trees. The dogs went berserk, howling and snapping at the air. Suddenly, the water in the center of the clearing began to churn. Bubbles rose to the surface, bursting with the smell of sulfur and rot. The horses reared, throwing the men into the muck. Krenshaw scrambled to his feet, water sloshing into his boots, his rifle held high. "Show yourself," he screamed, his voice cracking, sounding tiny against the immensity of the swamp. "Come out and face me." And then she did, or at least an image of her appeared. 50 yards away, standing on the surface of the water as if it were polished glass, was Zora. She was no longer the ragged runaway child. In the vision, she was 10 feet tall, her skin composed of the night sky, her eyes 2 burning suns of amber fire. She didn't speak, but her voice echoed in their skulls a telepathic thunderclap. "You are not the hunters here. You are the trespassers, and the swamp is hungry." A Boggs broke first. With a shriek of pure, unadulterated madness, he dropped his weapon and scrambled away, splashing blindly into the thicket, heedless of the thorns tearing his face. Doyle fell to his knees in the water, sobbing, clutching his rosary, paralyzed by the divine terror of the sight. Krenshaw alone remained standing, though his legs trembled violently. He raised his rifle, aiming at the giant spectral child. "I am Silus Krenshaw," he roared, a desperate assertion of identity against the void. "I do not fear haunts." He pulled the trigger. The gun fired, a flash of sparks and smoke. But the bullet passed harmlessly through the image, rippling it like a reflection in a disturbed pond. The giant Zora threw her head back and laughed, a sound of crashing waves and breaking timber. And the water around Krenshaw suddenly erupted, dragging him down into the dark. Silus Krenshaw broke the surface of the black water, gasping for air that tasted of sulfur and ancient decay. The spectral giantess had vanished, dissolving into mist, but the terror she had heralded was only beginning to take root. The swamp was no longer a passive landscape of water and wood. It had become a hostile, sentient entity. The water around him didn't just ripple, it grasped. Roots beneath the surface felt like skeletal fingers clawing at his boots, trying to drag him back down into the silt. He scrambled toward the nearest hammock of solid ground, his movements frantic and uncoordinated, stripping him of the predatory grace he had cultivated over decades. His rifle was gone, lost to the muck, and with it went his primary illusion of control. He was a man defined by his ability to dominate through force, and he had just been disarmed by a 10-year-old girl's dream. As he hauled himself onto the mud, shivering violently, he realized that the silence of the swamp had returned, but it was the silence of a held breath, the pause before the executioner's blade drops. Doyle was gone. The Irishman had fled into the labyrinthine darkness, his mind shattered by the vision on the water. Boggs was somewhere nearby, whimpering in the sawgrass, curled into a fetal ball, broken by a fear that no amount of money could balm. Krenshaw was effectively alone. He tried to stand, to assert his authority over the empty air, but his legs refused to hold him steady. Then the fog began to coalesce. It didn't just roll in, it formed shapes. From the dark spaces between the cypress trees, from the heavy curtains of Spanish moss, and rising from the water itself, figures began to materialize. They were not solid, yet they blocked the dim light. They were gray and translucent, composed of mist and memory. At first, Krenshaw tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by swamp gas and exhaustion. But as they drifted closer, the details became undeniable. He saw the ragged clothes of field hands. He saw the iron collars. He saw the scars that mapped the history of the South's brutality on their spectral skin. These were not random spirits. They were the lost. The men and women who had died in these marshes trying to run. The ones Krenshaw and men like him had hunted down, or the ones who had simply vanished into the mud to escape the lash. Zora hadn't just conjured a scarecrow. She had opened a door. She had turned the marsh into a witness stand. The figures moved with a terrifying, silent slowness, gliding over the water without disturbing it. There were dozens of them, a silent army of the aggrieved, their eyes hollow voids that seemed to suck the light from the world. They didn't scream or attack. They simply watched. But their gaze was a physical weight pressing down on Krenshaw's chest, forcing him to confront the enormity of his own sins. He backed away, his boots slipping in the mud, until his back hit the rough bark of a tree. "Stay back," he rasped, his voice a broken ruin. "I was just doing a job. It's the law." The plea hung in the air, pathetic and absurd, instantly swallowed by the judgment of the dead. Miles away, the source of this apocalypse was collapsing. Zora let out a sharp cry and slumped forward. The connection to the spirit world severed abruptly. She fell into Sarah's arms, her body limp and burning with fever. The effort of raising the shadows, of pulling the psychic trauma of the land into physical form, had nearly killed her. Blood ran freely from her nose now, staining her ragged dress, and her breathing was shallow and ragged. "I made them remember," Zora whispered, her eyes fluttering closed. "I gave the ghosts a shape so he could see them. But they're heavy, Mama. They're so heavy." Sarah held her daughter tightly, rocking her back and forth, terror and awe warring in her heart. She looked out into the darkness, knowing that somewhere miles away, a bad man was facing a hell of his own making. "You rest now, baby," Sarah soothed, brushing the damp hair from Zora's forehead. "You did enough. You did more than enough. The swamp has him now." Back in the clearing, the psychological dismantling of Silus Krenshaw was complete. One of the figures, a tall man with shackles on his wrists, drifted closer than the others. He extended a hand, not to strike, but as if to offer an invitation. The sound of rattling chains filled Crenshaw's head, deafening and rhythmic, drowning out his own heartbeat. The rationality that Krenshaw prized, the belief in a world of master and slave, of order and property, disintegrated. He realized with a shattering clarity that he was the anomaly here in the wild, ancient justice of the earth. He was the criminal. The fear that gripped him wasn't just the fear of death. It was the fear of damnation. He screamed a roar, primal and raw, that tore his throat, and scrambled away from the figure, plunging blindly into the swamp. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't care. He just ran. He ran until his lungs burned like fire and his muscles failed. He tore through briar patches that shredded his clothes and skin. He waded through water teeming with snakes, heedless of the danger. He was no longer a hunter. He was prey chased not by dogs, but by the weight of a history he had helped enforce. Every shadow looked like a judge. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a verdict. He ran through the night, a madman in a ruined kingdom, until he collapsed on a small rise of ground miles from where he had started, utterly broken. He curled up in the mud, covering his head with his arms, shaking uncontrollably. Silus Krenshaw, the man who had never lost a trail, was lost. He would eventually crawl out of that swamp 3 days later, half-starved. His hair turned stark white, babbling about judgment and eyes in the dark. He would never hold a weapon again. He would never hunt another human being. The legend of the girl who broke the slave catcher would spread from cabin to cabin. But the truth was simpler. She hadn't broken him. She had simply forced him to look in the mirror. With the immediate threat neutralized, the urgency of the moment shifted from combat to survival. The sun rose on the 3rd day, finding Sarah and Zora miles to the northwest, moving slowly. Zora was weak, barely able to walk, her steps faltering. Sarah supported her, becoming the strength for both of them. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, replaced by the grinding reality of their situation. They were exhausted, starving, and still deep in Confederate territory. But the air felt different now. The oppressive weight of pursuit was gone. The birds were singing again. The swamp, which had been a weapon the night before, returned to being just a place, a difficult, dangerous, beautiful place. "We keep moving," Sarah whispered to her daughter and to herself. "We walk until we see blue uniforms. We walk until we're free." They left the marshlands behind, transitioning into the pine forests and red clay hills of Middle Tennessee, moving toward a destiny that was no longer written by their masters, but by their own weary feet. The journey out of the Tennessee marshlands and toward the theoretical safety of the Union lines was an ordeal that made the terror of the hunt seem almost merciful by comparison. For 18 grueling days, Sarah and Zora moved northwest, navigating a landscape that was actively hostile to their existence. The terrain shifted from the sodden, forgiving cover of the swamps to the exposed pine barrens and red clay hills of central Tennessee. Here the war was not a rumor, but a physical scar on the land. They passed burned-out homesteads, trampled fields where crops had been seized by foraging armies, and roads churned into mud by the passage of heavy artillery. Hunger became their constant companion, a dull ache that sharpened into agony by the third day. They survived on foraging, bitter wild onions, handfuls of unripe berries, and once a rabbit that Zora had seemingly coaxed out of its burrow with a quiet melody, allowing Sarah to catch it with her bare hands. The girl's power was changing, evolving from the explosive defensive force she had wielded against Krenshaw into something subtler. A survival instinct that bordered on precognition. During the second week, the danger escalated. The deeper they moved into the contested borderlands, the thicker the Confederate patrols became. On the 11th night, while following the curve of a dry creek bed, they nearly stumbled into a squad of gray-clad soldiers. There was no time to run, no cover to hide behind except a slight depression in the earth beneath an overhang of roots. Sarah pressed Zora into the dirt, shielding the girl's body with her own, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The soldiers were so close that Sarah could smell the stale tobacco smoke on their clothes and hear the leather creak of their boots. One of the men stopped directly above them, peering down into the shadows of the creek bed. By all laws of physics and light, he should have seen them. But Zora, trembling with exhaustion, was gripping her mother's hand, murmuring a single repetitive syllable. The soldier's gaze passed over them, as if they were nothing more than empty air or a pile of dead leaves. He spat into the dust inches from Sarah's head and moved on. When they were gone, Zora collapsed, blood trickling from both nostrils, her skin cold to the touch. She had bent the light, or perhaps the soldiers' minds, rendering them invisible in plain sight. 3 days later, they encountered others. It happened in a dense thicket of scrub oak, where Sarah had decided to risk a daylight rest. They woke to find 4 faces staring at them. 2 men, a woman named Mary, and a teenage boy named James. Runaways from a sugar plantation near Nashville. The meeting was tense, filled with the instinctive suspicion of the hunted, but it quickly dissolved into a shared, desperate camaraderie. Mary had heard whispers of them. The grapevine telegraph, the clandestine communication network of the enslaved, traveled faster than horses. "They talk about a girl," Mary said, looking at Zora with wide, reverent eyes. "A girl with amber eyes who broke a slave catcher in the swamp. They say she walks with spirits." Zora shrank from the praise, uncomfortable with being a legend when she felt so much like a tired, hungry child. "We're just walking," Zora said softly. "Same as you." But the group stayed close to her, drawn by the palpable energy that hummed around her, sensing that this child was their best chance of making it across the final threshold. The final barrier was the Cumberland River. It was wide, swollen with recent rains, and the current moved with a muscular violence. On the far bank, illuminated by the ghostly light of a full moon, stood a line of fortifications. Earthworks and wooden palisades cut a jagged silhouette against the sky. The dilemma was agonizing. Were those Union fires or Confederate ones? To cross into the hands of the enemy would mean immediate capture, likely execution, or a return to chains that would be tighter than before. To stay on this side was to starve or be caught by the patrols that were closing in. "Someone has to look," the older man of the group whispered. "Someone has to get close enough to see the uniforms." Zora stepped forward before Sarah could stop her. "I'll go," she said. "The water knows me." Despite Sarah's terrified protests, the logic was undeniable. Zora could move silently. She could hold her breath longer than any adult. She had a rapport with the natural world that made her the perfect scout. Sarah stood on the muddy bank, watching her daughter's small head bob in the dark water until it disappeared into the shadows of the opposite shore. The wait was an eternity, a suspension of time, where every second felt like a physical blow. Mary held Sarah's hand, humming a low, tuneless melody to keep the panic at bay. An hour passed, then two. Just as the sky began to bleed into the purple bruise of pre-dawn, Zora returned. She dragged herself out of the water, shivering violently. Her lips were blue, but her eyes were blazing with a frantic, joyful light. "Blue," she gasped, her teeth chattering. "They're wearing blue, Mama. And they're like us." Sarah didn't understand at first. "Like us? Black men?" Zora whispered. "Black men with rifles. It's the 54th Massachusetts. They're soldiers, Mama. Real soldiers." The revelation sent a shockwave through the group. The idea of armed black men, uniformed and sanctioned by the government to fight their former masters, was a dream so radical it was hard to comprehend. They crossed at first light. It was a perilous swim, the current fighting them every inch of the way, but the sight of the blue uniforms on the far bank acted as a beacon. As they dragged themselves onto the Union, held shore, dripping and exhausted, they were not met with chains or whips. A sergeant, a tall black man with chevrons on his sleeve and a face etched with the gravity of war, stepped forward. He lowered his rifle and extended a hand to Sarah. "Welcome to the United States Army lines," he said, his voice deep and steady. "You are under federal protection. You are free." The word hung in the air, heavy and strange. Free. Sarah tried to say something, to offer thanks, but her legs gave out and she fell to her knees in the mud, weeping. Great, heaving sobs shook her entire body, releasing years of accumulated terror and grief. Around her, the others were crying too, embracing the soldiers, touching the blue wool of their uniforms as if to verify they were real. If this story of resistance and the impossible journey to freedom moved you, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Drop a comment below. What do you think became of Zora after the war? Your interaction helps keep these histories alive. In the safety of the contraband camp, as they were fed and given dry clothes, the reality of their new life began to settle. Zora sat wrapped in a wool blanket, sipping tin cup coffee, watching the camp bustle with activity. She was no longer the supernatural force of the swamp. She was just a girl again, safe in the shadow of her mother. The soldiers came by to see her, asking shyly if the stories were true, if she really had conjured ghosts to scare off Silus Krenshaw. Zora just smiled, a tired, enigmatic smile, and said nothing. She knew that the legend of the girl who walked with spirits would outgrow her. It would travel through the camps, across the battlefields, and down through the generations. It would become a ghost story for the overseers and a prayer for the enslaved. But for Zora, the magic wasn't in the rootwork or the visions. The real magic was simply that they were here, sitting on the earth answering to no one but themselves. Sarah looked at her daughter, seeing the amber flecks in her eyes catch the morning sun. The war was far from over. The road ahead would be paved with the bitter struggles of reconstruction, of a nation fighting to define what black freedom actually meant. There would be poverty and hatred and new forms of bondage to resist. But that was a fight for tomorrow. Tonight they would sleep without listening for the bell. Tonight they belonged to themselves. The grandmother's prophecy had been fulfilled not by a miracle, but by the relentless, terrifying, beautiful will of a mother and child who refused to break. In the ledger of history, where they had once been written as property, they now wrote their own names in ink that would never fade. They were here. They were alive.